Hi, my name is Reid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and today I'd like to talk about recovering the ability to think critically after narcissistic abuse. So in today's video, I'd like to discuss how and why narcissistic abuse in early childhood especially can get under one's psychological and emotional skin and offer one potential shift in perspective that may prove liberating for the survivor of such abuse, particularly during their early childhood, or that is where it sort of started. And so I'll start with this scenario where a child is selected to be the scapegoat in the narcissistic family, where that child is somewhere from the age of 2 to 5 years old. I chose that time in life because from a cognitive development perspective, that's the time in our lives where we kind of understand the world as a reflection of ourselves. Researchers in child development, cognitive development, call this the period of egocentric thinking, or in a technical sense, it's called the pre-operational stage of cognitive development. And that's a term that a very prominent researcher in the field named Jean Piaget came up with. So during this period, children have great difficulty taking the perspective of others. And it's not because they're selfish or anything like that, but because their cognitive faculties have not yet matured enough to be able to do so. As a consequence, they end up living in a world where pleasant experiences feel very good and deserved, and unpleasant experiences feel very bad but also deserved, because sort of everything kind of emanates or comes back to oneself. And I think it's important that during this phase of our lives, we understand what's happening to us as something that we deserve to have happening to us, with the fact that from around the age of 2 to 3 is when we also sort of come online with having our own and expressing our own sense of will. I think a lot of survivors of narcissistic abuse have experienced or remember times where they seem to feel like the special little guy or little girl to mom or dad, the narcissistic mom or dad. And it wasn't until they began to kind of develop a will of their own that they suddenly found themselves in an adversarial position with their own parent. So if you couple that, very, I think, frequent phenomenon when a parent is narcissistic and they come to realize that the child they have is not just an extension of themselves, but another living, independent being with his or her own center of initiative and existence, with the fact that child is understanding that parent's behavior towards the child as, again, a reflection of the child, him or herself, and certainly the child deserves how the parent is treating him or her. So quite a combustible, in this case, interplay between where the child is in his or her cognitive development and what is often the sort of break in relationship with the narcissistic parent, because the child is coming into his or her own will. So to illustrate the child's, cognitive processes during this age 2 to around 7 phase of their cognitive development, let's say a child with a good enough set of parents falls down and scrapes his, let's say it's a boy, his knee, and starts crying, and his mother comes over, notices that he's in pain and holding his knee, and seeks to comfort him by something like, "Ooh, it looks like that hurts, oh," and then maybe she puts her arm on the child's shoulder and starts to rub him, and maybe hugs him if he seems open to it. The boy's not noticing his mother as a separate person and appreciating, that she noticed that he was in pain and helping him. He's just receiving the comfort of her acknowledgement of the state he's in, the pain that he's in. Also noticing that she's not in as much pain, but so she's able to kind of like notice where he's at, but be just right here. They call that markedness, for whatever it's worth. But it's an important feature of empathic connection. He may notice and hear the soothing tones in her voice, and as he soaks this in, he just sort of finds himself feeling better. It's not something he then thinks to thank her for, because now as he feels better, it's likely time to go on playing or go on to the next thing. And that's the transaction, as it were, in a loving, kind of good enough relationship between a child and a parent. Now, if we contrast that same child sort of falling down, skinning his knee example with a narcissistic mother, it could go quite differently, where she may expect him to show very dramatic displays of gratitude after, an expected act of caregiving for helping him when he skins his knee. And let's say that this same boy goes off to run and play after he's received the kind of like restorative care from the narcissistic mother. So then she may grow irate, slam something down, look at him as though he just took something of hers, and maybe even start yelling at him that the boy doesn't appreciate all that she does for him. Well, at this point, the child would have no way to understand this but through reference to himself. He is bad because he made his mom mad at him. He can't reason that she must have some pretty disturbed inner workings to be yelling so cruelly at a child, because he can't think into her mind as being something separate from his at this point in his life. So it's sort of easy to see how such a kid in such a situation might develop an egocentric belief of, I am bad because I make mommy hate me, or something to that effect. Things would likely be cast in very stark terms for the child at around this age. And suffice it to say, if in these kinds of scenarios, the narcissistic mother is not going to notice how her yelling and treatment of the child is making him feel even worse, and nor will she likely seek to repair it. And that's kind of why so often children of a narcissistic parent can develop these kinds of they would call them pathogenic beliefs about oneself, because these kinds of experiences happen to the child and nothing is done to try to repair it. The parent isn't making themselves available to say, that I'm sorry to have yelled at you. Mommy gets really upset at things with you that she probably shouldn't, and you're a good kid. Something like that, isn't going to happen with someone who's this narcissistic and as a parent. But in contrast, let's say in a good enough parent, if let's say a child puts their hand near a hot stove and the parent says, "Hey, get out! Don't do that." Even with such a brief sort of outburst like that, I think a good enough parent would likely want to take time to apologize to the child and make clear that it was the child's safety the parent was concerned with, and that's what prompted them to react so loudly and maybe even scarily. And doing so allows the child to know that, okay, there can be breaks where I think my good parent is bad or mad at me, but in fact they're not. It's just something about the situation. And that makes these sort of breaks in relationship feel much more survivable, and what most kids fortunately get to enjoy in relation to their parents. There's already at this phase of cognitive development the sort of inborn tendency to understand everything as flowing as a reflection of the child, him or herself. And on top of that, if they've been selected into the scapegoated role in the narcissistic family, then the entire family system operates to kind of reinforce that same message, in essence, to blame anything that goes wrong in the family on that child. So the family's contempt, particularly narcissistic parents' contempt and hostility towards that child, the message is that is a product of the child's own badness, having nothing to do with these narcissistic family member and others themselves. So as you can imagine, like the child in this position at this stage in their development and with these types of surrounding influences cannot really think about the abusers and the abuse that they're receiving as a reflection of those abusers, rather than instead they think of it as a reflection of something within themselves. So in last week's video, I discussed the process of discriminating from safe versus unsafe people, and I think the ability to think about others where one can think of that person, their actions, attitudes, and choices as reflective of who they are, rather than reflective of who the thinker is a very necessary ingredient to be able to make that assessment. of who's safe versus unsafe. And I think a profound shift can occur in the process of recovering from narcissistic abuse when consciously an individual gets to see that the abusiveness of the narcissist was really a reflection of that narcissistic individual and that person's character, rather than having anything to do with the character of the survivor. And of course, this shift would have been very dangerous to do when in close proximity to the narcissist earlier in life for a lot of reasons. I think it's pretty likely that the narcissist would have increased the intensity of his or her attacks, maybe even to an unsurvivable degree, if the child had not complied with this presupposition that it was the child, not the parent, who was the problem, that the narcissistic parent requires the child go along with in order to share any kind of reality with that parent. However, when enough psychological and emotional distance is put between the survivor and the narcissist, and I might add enough countervailing experiences with other safe people, good relationships come into the fore for the survivor, then this new way of making sense of who others are may get to take hold. And I think it can often come along with an incredible sense of liberation and reduction in tension. And that is because the sort of burden or overburden that the survivors had to carry can get sort of like set down, where the world becomes one more where everyone has to carry their own suitcase, as it were, and that when someone behaves badly, then we get to think of that as belonging to that person, not belonging to oneself. And I should say that oftentimes during this process, there may be bouts of ambivalence, where the survivor may occupy a frame of mind where you're thinking of the other person as separate and accountable for their own behavior and reflective of their own character, and as a result, the survivor may entertain thoughts that are kind of critical of that other person, in the sense of entertaining one's own thoughts about that person. They don't have to be negative per se, but they're sort of free of having to come to a certain preordained conclusion, that one can kind of think, again, it's just sort of freely about who that person is and whether one wants the level of closeness one wants to have with that person, based on this sort of critical assessment of who they are. And in the course of doing that, the person is sort of thinking of the other person. A strong sense of guilt or self-blame may come about, and it may shift where suddenly the survivor maybe finds himself being thought of through the eyes of the other person, and maybe even imagine or even feel the outrage. If the person you're thinking about is sort of being thought of as an unsafe person, then there may be this sort of sudden shift of like, thinking about oneself through the eyes of that unsafe person, thinking about the indignation, outrage, contempt, hostility that other person might react with if they knew that you, sort of the survivor, were thinking of them in this manner. And in this moment of ambivalence, it can feel as though one is thinking more about that person's reaction to the self than one's own reaction to that person. And I think here's where good, safe relationships with safe people can really help to bulwark the survivor, because being able to talk about your own perceptions with folks who accept your point of view, and then kind of coming back to your feelings about this person, is often something that just is naturally reinforced when in an interaction with a safe person. And it kind of hallmarks this sort of like jumping into the perspective of the other that can happen with during these bouts of ambivalence when critically thinking about an unsafe person. So all this is to say that if one stays with this way of thinking critically or freely about others, then these bouts of ambivalence and attacks of guilt and shifts to thinking about oneself through the eyes of the unsafe other gradually diminish, I believe, and one gets left with your own perspective where you don't have to take more responsibility for others than what's appropriate. That is, others' bad behavior is a reflection of who they are, not a reflection of who you are. Well, thank you again for tuning in this week. It just continues to be a real joy to be able to to post these videos and know that they're of some use to folks. And I look forward to posting again next week, Sundays, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take care.